some breaking news in the wrestling world, and actually in this case it was more the wrestling journalism world, and I just wanted to kind of cover what we know and what the fallout from it has been. And Bruce Mitchell of the Pro Wrestling Torch, I guess, was released because of an article that he wrote on the death of Brodie Lee, also known as Luke Harper. And that's something that was happened just like 3 days ago, and we covered it here and just did a little article and talked more about the experiences with him. We didn't really get into that. We just shared some experiences outside the ring and what a nice guy he was, and always thought Brodie Lee was such a nice guy, and so glad that I had a couple chances to talk to him, although it be very briefly, but just to get a little bit of to know his personality and what a nice guy he was. So all the comments since then have been just about how he was a family man and everything else like that, and nothing surprising, to the point where, yeah, everyone else, he seems to be so respected. If you see the wrestlers come out and talk about how respected he is. But then we have a Pro Wrestling Torch column by Bruce Mitchell. I believe this made it to the Pro Wrestling Torch online newsletter for quickly before it got taken down, and that's where all the controversy starts. It was an opinion piece by Bruce Mitchell that pretty much, I've read the piece, and it pretty much talks about Brodie Lee. It's pretty much a tribute to his death and starts off that way, and his flow is like you would expect it to. Talks about him being a family man, talks about his WWE, but how he kind of got stuck in the mid card, so he bet on himself, wanted to join AEW because he thought he could become a little better star in AEW, less money, but it was paying off because now he was starting to become a star, and the money would soon be there. He compares him to Bruiser Brody in a compliment about his physical presence and how he's just that kind of guy. I mean, that was certainly a compliment there. And then he talks, yeah, and he goes back and talks about his WWE days and with the Bludgeon. He thought the Bludgeon Brothers were a great tag team. And now, and finally, the present day, or at least a couple months ago, where Brody, he was just establishing himself in AEW, and then he disappeared, and that's kind of where the controversy begins then too, because Mitchell then goes into comments about how it was so mysterious how he disappeared, and he actually starts it by talking about how the AEW and WWE were already compromising pandemic health standards because they were meeting, and they were meeting to wrestle, while a lot of we saw the other major sports leagues at least take a break for a little while. And why did wrestling get to stay? And he accused the WWE of not being transparent in some of the consequences of people who are putting on the shows. And then he also talked about the Benoit cover-up that he thinks WWE did, and how people had to fall in line in order to stay employed by WWE. If they fell out of line in that case, they couldn't. So then he questions what really happened to Brodie Lee. How did he get sick? We didn't hear anything about it. And the next thing you know, he died of a lung disease that was not COVID related, but the whole country is filled with COVID diseases, and how can someone healthy die of a lung disease if it's not COVID related? And he questions, did he had COVID earlier and this was just the fallout from it? And pretty much questions that very much to the point, very much saying at least the way he saw it, and not sparing any words, just gonna tell it like he is in his mind. And I mean, it was a very well written article in the sense that, I mean, he makes his intention clear, and it's a very strong opinion. And so that's what happened. And the next thing you know is the Torch appears to have released him after 30 years. And just the fallout from this is just going crazy. We've had wrestlers and stuff comment online, like I believe Chris Hero commented and pretty much lambasted him about how bad it was. Wade Keller, the editor of the Torch, I saw something where he said he did not get the chance to vet this, as he maybe would have in a different opinion piece, and he probably should have. So that's how it got online. He took it down right away. He apologized to the family on top of that. So, and yeah, now Bruce Mitchell's no longer with the Torch after 30 years. Bruce was a columnist for the Torch from as long as I can remember, and so if you go back to read any Torches from the 90s and the aughts, and it's just like you have there's Bruce Mitchell columns everywhere. His columns were he did some. I mean, part of what made him, I think, a good writer was strong opinions, and he would tell it like he thought it was. And I always appreciated reading his columns. But I guess the question now becomes is like, to me, this wasn't any different than you see in the national news one way or another, newspapers, TV news, and now, of course, we have internet news all over the place, and we have all sorts of opinions on this left and right. We have opinions that, yeah, you have opinions that would kind of fall in line with this. You have opinions that would be totally different than this. You've had opinions on people's deaths, and it just kind of seems to be a part of our culture now. And the first time it really crosses over into the wrestling world, it becomes a big thing with 30-year writer getting released and a lot of controversy online. So where can we go as wrestling journalists? What are we allowed to cover? What aren't we allowed to cover? And why are there certain things that we can and can't? So I think the biggest problem for this article maybe wasn't even necessarily the accusation of the COVID being a possibility, but it's just maybe more of the insensitivity of it so close to the death, and just kind of like, if this is what the family says the death is, then we should all respect that. And so I totally understand that, and I would be the type of person that would just like, I don't ask questions. I mean, if someone says this is the way it is, this is the way it is. But then isn't that what a journalist is for, is to ask the hard questions sometimes. And at least in Bruce's mind, something wasn't making sense here. I think the main problem he ran into was the fact that he really it was all an opinion piece. And there really wasn't the only facts that he had to back it up were the history of WWE. So yeah, it's certainly something that, it could happen, because it's why wouldn't it happen? This is what people want, but there was nothing in this specific case that would say, well, this is why it happened this way. There's nothing that gave any evidence that it would happen in any way other than what the family had said, and I think that's why Bruce got in trouble. But why? So what can we do moving forward? Because if Bruce was writing for like a national newspaper or something, this would have been just normal, and there would have been controversy probably one way or another, but it wouldn't have been. I mean, but you would have it allowed to be written. And now we're in the professional wrestling world, and you can't even bring up something like this. Is it because it's just the first time, and we're just so used to it in the national news that we've just become almost immune to it, where we just don't even pay attention? It's just becomes something that we don't even want to deal with anymore, or unless we're one of those people that wants to deal with it constantly, then it always gives us something to feed with. And this is really the first time it worked its way over into the wrestling world. We had just a very little controversy about meeting. I know some political controversy, maybe why is the WWE getting to meet in Florida when other things are stopped? Was there anything given to the governor? Was it anything political? We have Linda McMahon, of course, in Donald Trump's cabinet. Where did all the politics fall? That's really the only thing I've ever really heard of COVID and wrestling up to this point. And now all of a sudden, a pretty powerful writer, probably I believe it's the second biggest newsletter behind Meltzer's Wrestling Observer. I'm not sure if I have my facts correct there. It might be bigger, but in my mind, I would call it the second biggest wrestling newsletter behind Meltzer's Observer. So you have, and one of the main columnists for that all of a sudden writing about COVID and questioning something that just everyone accepted as part of the mainstream, something that happened, and a big thing that happened, something we don't see the death of active wrestlers very much unless it's something either an accident or something related to substance abuse or it's like an overdose or something like that. I mean, it kind of it's hit us a few times, but yeah, this one was kind of shocking to everybody. And one writer decided to bring up the tough questions, and now all of a sudden no one wants to talk about it. But if you look online, he gets lambasted so many times by people saying this is insensitive, he has no facts and stuff like that. But you do see a lot of support for him as well, saying, yeah, people should be asking these kind of questions. Thank you for bringing it up. Why aren't more people asking these kind of questions? So yeah, so then I go back to the mainstream media world, and if I saw an article or a newscast on one of the major networks tonight, and they talked about a COVID controversy of some kind, I'll just kind of be like, yep, that's the way the world's going right now. And now someone brings it up in the wrestling world, and they are no longer. Somebody actually accused, I saw a comment that said, well, this is all the Torch knew about this, and this is their way of building ratings. And then I went on. If you listen to Jim Cornette talk about both Wade Keller and Bruce Mitchell, he does not seem to like either of them, and he even accused them of just making up stuff in order to sell more copies. So then you always have that question too. But Jim Cornette, I don't think there's any. I think anyone in the wrestling world knows that Cornette does not like Wade Keller and Bruce Mitchell. And so that's probably what he would say at this point. And so does that have any credibility? How do we move forward in covering wrestling then if we can't even bring this up? And not saying that I really would like to, because that's not what I'm into, is figuring out what the COVID controversies are in the world. But at the same time, what if there's more stuff that happens moving forward? What if it could be COVID, could not be COVID? What if we know it's COVID? And I mean, are we allowed to deal with stuff like that? Are we allowed to deal with questions? If we meet for WrestleMania next year, and I mean, what are the COVID questions going to be allowed? Are we going to be, and then is there going to be a debate on masks? Is there going to be a debate on meeting? Is there going to be a debate on how many people can meet? And then not only WrestleMania in the stadium, because I would assume that they do something in the stadium to cover it, but what about all these other shows that are around WrestleMania weekend? Are they going to take place? I would assume if WrestleMania is going to take place, that some of these shows are going to take place, and then what are their rules going to be, and what can happen, and are some, I would assume some of the bigger ones are going to have some protocols, but then you have like your not outlaw, like there used to be outlaw wrestling, which would be the stuff that was like right across the river or something, but now you're gonna have your outlaw wrestling conventions right around WrestleMania. And I mean, so what are they gonna do? And then what happens if people start getting COVID, and what's gonna happen there, and who's gonna take it seriously, who's not gonna take it seriously? Is it something we should take seriously? See, there's so many questions, and here we have our first journalist bringing it up, and he is no longer writing for the company that he wrote for. So I think we just kind of hit the tip of the iceberg here. Like I said, I respect Bruce Mitchell as a person. He's always been very kind to me, and I have enjoyed his work. And so he brought up a issue that was very controversial, and everyone's going to have their opinion on it. And maybe it was a little bit too close. I mean, when someone dies, that's kind of, it's kind of hard to start bringing up stuff like this without seeming disrespectful to the family, and that's probably where he got in the most trouble. But at the same time, that happens in the world all over the place, and other people's families have had to go through that. It's just not through the wrestling world. And we've kind of gotten used to that as a society, which is kind of sad. And so who knows where this is going to go from the future. But it'll be interesting to see what the further fallout from this is. Bruce did, he was part of the Bruiser Brody tribute at the Hall of Fame in Waterloo, Iowa, and he did a really good tribute. And he must love Bruiser Brody, because he even mentioned him there. I know he respects him. And so you can actually watch that, just Bruiser Brody Waterloo Hall of Fame, earlier on my channel, and it's a great way to, it's like an hour tribute to him. We got some other, I think Stan Hansen's there, I believe Tony Gurria, and they talk about Bruiser Brody, and it's a really good thing. And that's, yeah, like I said, Bruce is just, that's who he's been for the last however long, and it'll be interesting to see what he does in the wrestling world beyond this. What happens with the fallout from the torch? Is there going to be any more controversy based on this? And what happens to wrestling as we move forward? And what happens the next time something with COVID comes up in the wrestling world? How are we going to be able to cover it? And is there going to be backlash if we cover it in one way and people don't agree with the way we're covering it? And are they going to give backlash to it? Are the people that agree with Bruce going to now do something and boycott the torch, or even bring this up more? And are the people, yeah, how is that going to work, and where do we go from here? So it's just interesting. I know the stories are just going to keep coming. It's been a crazy week for wrestling. We lost some great stars. We lost Brodie Lee. We lost Danny Hodge, and it's just been a rough week in the wrestling world. And now we've got our first COVID controversy in the journalism part of the wrestling world, and it'll be interesting to see where this goes from here. I'll probably do another story if there's more to cover on this, but until then, I'll just leave it at that.